Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the changing landscape of technology and social media, and how technology and social media have impacted not just recruitment, but human capital in general, careers in general, because I don't think it's insignificant. And there's a few things I'd like to talk about in that regard. So essentially, it's about how social media has impacted the way people deal with one another throughout the hiring process. Um, and I think it's also about how even on onboarding, once people are hired, how social media can be both a positive and a negative influence within this context. So a few points. First of all, I'd like to start with the fact that the Rolodex still exists, but it's gone digitized. So even the word Rolodex doesn't necessarily mean anything to people born post 1994, 1995. But it used to be a box of cards one would look at to get contacts. Well, now everyone seems to have that in their pocket on their phone. And it starts with that, but it's also the fact that you can reach out to anybody anywhere now through social media. And it's on a 24/7 basis, which again, has changed things very much over the last, I'd say, 20 years. The first thing that I want to talk about, though, is how accessible people are. Because, 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of academics and business people talked about what Marshall McLuhan referred to as intimate proximity. So McLuhan really had this idea now that TV had emerged. And if we take a look at business, but more specifically politics, when John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon debated in 1960, and all of a sudden your politicians were in your living room, and of course we had in the 1940s and 50s television rising up and the sitcoms, and all of a sudden you had entertainment, but also information right there in your living room. So McLuhan talked about intimate proximity, the fact that someone could be miles away, hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, but they were right in front of you. And all of a sudden proximity changed. Well, after the rise of social media, obviously the internet first, but social media, something struck me that that there was a massive shift, and I called it intimate accessibility. So we were all accessible now. Proximity is one thing, but you can't exactly speak to your TV. So that interactive nature that we all know about really has had a massive impact on how we live together, how we work together specifically. So that's one thing. The fact that, first of all, it's real time. And secondly, the fact that it's created a dynamic where people just don't stop. We're constantly on the go. We're constantly checking these phones, these devices. Has it increased our productivity? Yes, but as I always say in these contexts, it's two steps forwards, or maybe three steps forward, one step back. But for the most part, it really has improved our situation from a professional and personal standpoint. So, this concept of intimate accessibility, we do have to put some guards and some measures on it, because you risk burnout, you risk a sense of not necessarily giving people the time to respond and think, which is, of course, before the digital revolution. If somebody was trying to reach you, what have you, and they left a message with someone else in the old days, you had a chance to think about it and respond. Well, that's gone now. So from that perspective, not only is it the factor of burnout, but it's also the factor of, with this constant need to respond in the moment, what we're left with is often kind of perfunctory or just even kind of reactive answers or responses. And especially in the fact that in social media, there really isn't a buffer or a filter. And what are we left with after all of that is a tweeting president who basically puts out every single thought that comes through his mind. And I'm referring, of course, to the president of the United States, without necessarily filtering it or having others filter it. And of course, in business, that can be a dangerous thing as well. So that's one point. The other point that I think is important and worth thinking about is how it's changed the perspectives of people in the workforce as a result of these things. not just candidates and hiring managers, but also employers and employees once they get beyond that, hiring stage. So basically, in terms of how it's impacted the world of recruitment, which, as you know, is something very close to me, where I've spent my last 20 years, it struck me, but I'm not sure when exactly it happened, but somewhere along the line, finding people became very easy. A long time ago, that's where recruiters and HR leaders would find some degree of value in their ability to find really uh, some of the best talent and find kind of individuals that were, for lack of a better word, elusive. But it's become very easy. Everyone's out there. Regardless of how much you participate in social media, I think we're at a point now where 80 to 90% of business professionals have at least a shell or a shadow of a LinkedIn profile. And Facebook, of course, takes on another dimension in the professional realm. I could spend an hour talking about that, the advantages, but also the pitfalls of Facebook in the work environment. And I think a lot of younger people are being advised to be very cautious about what they put up there. I think it was President Obama who recently said if Facebook or Snapchat or social media existed when he was young, he would have never become president. So that's a whole other issue that I think we can get into at another time. But just the mere fact that it's so easy to find people and so easy to have them present themselves in this new social media environment, that finding people is no longer something that is arduous or challenging. The challenge now is to how to get through this glut, because there's so much information, so much available. It's the filtering process where both hiring managers and recruiters can really add their value, because you have an ability to go through tens or even thousands of LinkedIn profiles before you see a single resume. The trick is really developing a process around seeing through a lot of the haze and the fog. And the term that I use in terms of what most people put out there, I call it their digital avatars. And people recently have talked about on Facebook, on a social site, it's your highlight reel. Well, in a sense, that's not a bad thing, because resumes are kept short for a reason. We don't want a 200-page dissertation on your career. But on the other hand, people need to be skeptical. Is all the information there? Both people creating the information and those reading it, and trying to see through some of the smoke and mirrors. And I think that's something that, again, within the recruitment field and within the hiring field and with the business field in general, we need to, proceed with caution. As President Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. And I think that's so important that individuals, when they're analyzing this stuff, have a healthy degree of skepticism. So I think that's another key point. And I think it's something that we're going to continue to refine as time goes on. So in a nutshell, and the reason I do use the term digital avatar, obviously as a nod not just to Jim Cameron's movie and what have you, the term avatar has become so ubiquitous now. It's not reality. It's a conjured up image that represents or reflects grains of truth. And sometimes the details, are what make or break a situation. And so we can't forget it. I won't use the cliche, the devil's in the details, but what I will say is that, especially on more technical roles, we have to be very, very conscious of analyzing people's information that they put out in social media. So for example, if someone were to say, they have experience with these specific, and I'll use a technology developer or an architect. So they have specific experience within certain technology languages and platforms. Well, does that mean that you worked on a project where that was used, or you actually have proficiency in it? And unfortunately, in the case of resumes, be it in social media or not, but let's say more specifically on LinkedIn, it's challenging to scrutinize that. However, you can tell by taking a look at what they list as their skills and experience and applying it to the context. There are certain ways that you can tell whether or not somebody truly has experience in an area, or whether it's something that they're just laundry listing, with very little truth to it. So I think from that perspective, it behooves all of us, anyone who's hiring, anyone who is looking to get hired, or anyone who just simply wants to promote themselves on an ongoing basis, perhaps even on a contract basis, to have a constant brand out there, that they be wary of not over promoting and that they have a certain degree of accuracy. But perhaps more importantly to those hiring, as I said, really dig deep and try to analyze even a simple LinkedIn profile to determine whether or not this is true, and the veracity of it, and what have you as they go through it. So the third thing I want to address, though, in all of this is it has affected, from more of a social standpoint, how we interact. Now, earlier I talked about the fact that we don't necessarily put the time in. We're in for example, on Twitter, we only have a certain set of characters, but that's a choice. I recall when I was in grad school, completing my master's in communication and public policy, one of my professors said, essentially, and keep in mind, I was studying in the United States, so without being overly critical, he used the analogy of a gun and a bullet, although he was a very left-leaning, pro-gun control individual. He used the example of a gun and a bullet. He said, you've got to see your sentence as a gun and every word as a bullet, and think about the power in that. So try to choose, the most effective gun, the most effective bullet, and every single character, every single word matters. And I think that's what people need to be more conscious of, especially the generations coming up, is that, and obviously, from a style standpoint, grammatical errors, actually, I would have to say, are less of an issue, especially in today's, in today's, the pace to which today's people conduct business. I'm not suggesting in any way that you're not going to be held accountable to a grammatical error, but more important than that would be the actual substance of your thought. So I would recommend to anyone who is putting out anything on social media, think before you press send, think before you click, and really go over it if you can. Obviously, there's certain time limits, but I think some of those are self-imposed. Things can always wait a little longer. We've gone from a society that went at a bit of a slower pace and still managed to get a lot of things done, to this rapid fire culture that I think we need to be mindful of. So from that perspective, within social media, there's the second point, other than how quickly we put things out and how often we're not concerned about the reliability, accountability, and accuracy. The other factor is, from a social standpoint, that there's this barrier between so many people in how they communicate. Before email, if you had a chance to speak to someone on the phone, that personal communication that was so important in past generations, I think has subsided. So what I would tell younger people is to be conscious of just because you're hiding by a screen, or behind a screen, just because there's that barrier between you, shouldn't change how significant things like tone, and I'll use a word, although it's a little bit of a kind of in an esoteric concept, the concept of energy. What's the energy of your message? Because communication is so key, and how you present, even if it's done digitally, how you present a message is so important. Now, unfortunately, in the rise of social media and technology, some of that has really also gotten lost. So I think we have to go back to fundamental principles. And I guess to wrap it up, what I'd like to say on this concept is, yes, we've taken 3 steps forward and 1 step back, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't and can't consciously look at ways to improve the way we interact with each other in this brave new world, in this world of 100 million people at your digital Rolodex and growing. So I guess those are the thoughts that I would share to both individuals who are coming up, but also the older generations that are adapting to this, both baby boomers and Generation X, is to be mindful of that some of the younger people have not really come up in the same kind of world. and the significant impact that the digital revolution, particularly over the last 20 years, and more specifically beyond the internet, how social media has changed all that. So if we're more conscious in how we deal with one another, I think in the end we're going to be a lot more effective. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and I look forward to sharing more thoughts and ideas and in future on this. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.